from Great Earth. My name is Dan. It's a pleasure for you and I be here on this stream. I thank you so much for joining me. We'll start out with the numbers. Gaza, Palestine, Israel. I might discard playing it. Alright. Israel, October 7th, 1,139 Israelis were killed, with 8,730 injured. In Palestine, since October 7th to June 7th, 36,731 have been killed, including more than 15,000 children, with more than 10,000 missing. That 10,000 missing is very important because the bulldozing that Israel is doing, I don't think they're checking for bodies or survivors, which for days people have been able to live under the rubble. Also, 130 remain captive in Gaza by Hamas. Throughout these numbers, this new Guardian article that came out revealed repairing Israel's destruction of Gaza will come at huge climate cost. Reconstructing buildings destroyed in first 4 months of Israeli assault will generate nearly 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now that would add to our carbon budget in the atmosphere, which is rapidly reaching a 5-year critical crunch. The carbon cost of rebuilding Gaza will be greater than the annual greenhouse gas emissions generated individually by 135 countries, exacerbating the global climate emergency on top of the unprecedented death toll new research reveals. Reconstructed the estimated 200,000 apartment buildings, schools, universities, hospitals, mosques, bakeries, water and sewage plants damaged and destroyed by Israel in the first 4 months of the war will generate as much as 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent, according to a new analysis by researchers in the US and the UK. This is on par with total 2022 emissions generated by countries such as Portugal and Sweden, and more than twice the annual emissions of Afghanistan. It's not a small number to take into account, where I believe it's, what is the carbon budget in the atmosphere? We can only emit 250 billion tons. So I see carbon budget. Let's go with 250 billion tons. $60 million tons. Seems like a little bit compared to what we're talking about, rebuilding an entire society. And that's if and when Israel calls off this war and allows Palestine to remain with what little they have left now, being bombed into over 70% of their buildings have been completely destroyed. Long-term reconstruction will generate the largest carbon cost from the war in Gaza, where Israel has killed more than 36,500 Palestinians, mostly women and children, and thousands more remain buried under the rubble and presumed dead. Around 26 million tons of debris and rubble have been left in the wake of Israel's bombardment, which could take years to clean up. And this is, since we're talking about carbon, talking about releasing carbon, the amount of heavy machinery that it would require to clean this up, to repair, to cut concrete, to cut through cable and wire, is just going to only add and exacerbate the entire amount that is being projected regarding rebuilding Gaza. And I will state this, that this is in no way an article or a stream that is stating or alluding, inferring that Gaza should not be rebuilt. Not only Gaza should be rebuilt, Israel should leave Gaza and free the people in the West Bank and stop the war. These three things. But until they stop, the amount of damage in the south of Gaza is only going to increase, as a school was blown up, a UN school with 40 people inside, with at least 30 of them probably being children. That's another article, though. I digress. Sorry, I digress. Move past it. Long-term reconstruction will generate the largest carbon cost from the war of Gaza, where Israel has killed more than 36,500 Palestinians, mostly women and children, and thousands more remain buried under the rubble and presumed dead. Around 26 million tons of debris and rubble has been left in the wake of Israel's bombardment, which could take years to clean up. I just wanted to read that one more time, because it's crazy numbers. The research published on the Social Science Research Network shows the planet warming emissions generated by aerial and ground attacks during the first 120 days of the war on Gaza were greater than the annual carbon footprint of 26 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations, including Vanuatu and Greenland, according to the research, which is yet to be peer reviewed. Problematic. More than 99% of the estimated 652,552 metric tons of carbon dioxide estimated to have been generated in the first 4 months after the Hamas attack on October 7th are linked to Israel's aerial bombardment and ground invasion of Gaza. You have trucks, tanks, bulldozers, and the bulldozers Israel's driving around are monstrous. They are huge. There's no checking your blind side. I mean, they're just pushing debris, they're pushing rubble from one area to another and then making a makeshift road without ever checking the rubble for survivors. This is a tragedy. How many lives could have been spared, but Israel doesn't care. How do you make them care? How do you make them understand that what their country is doing is horribly wrong and not effective whatsoever when it comes to fighting terrorist cells? We've seen so many countries do it and get caught up in a war, and it just never seems to end. When does it end and where does it end? These aren't questions that they're asking themselves. They're just total victory. Total victory. They can blow up all of Gaza and they still might not ever get rid of Hamas. What does that tell you about Israel's priorities and human beings? Is it that it is yet another country that can massacre Muslims without any kind of response from the planet? People are suffering and dying, living in horrible conditions. I don't don't think of them as Muslims. I don't think of them as just people suffering. A giant amount of people suffering that I have a hard time relating to the number of the millions that are suffering. Almost 30% of the total CO2e emissions were generated by the 244 American cargo planes known to have flown bombs, munitions, and other military supplies to Israel in the first 120 days. According to the calculation, which is almost certainly a significant underestimate due to the missing military emissions data, because militaries don't have to report their anything. The carbon cost of the first 120 days of Israel's assault on Gaza was equivalent to the combined annual energy use of 77,200 American households. The analysis, shared exclusively with The Guardian, provides a conservative snapshot of the climate cost of the current war on Gaza, in addition to the unprecedented killings, deliberate famine, infrastructure damage, and environmental collapse. It also underscores the asymmetry of each side's war machinery. Hamas rockets fired into Israel between October 2023 and February 2024 generated an additional 1,140 carbon equivalent. Another 2,700 carbon equivalent were attributed to the fuel stored by the group prior to October 7th. Combined, the Hamas carbon footprint over the first 120 days was equivalent to the annual energy use of 454 American homes. Yeah, that doesn't... That's some... just human bodies just putting themselves into these scenarios. No tanks, vehicles, very low expense. These are the breakdown of the carbon emissions generated in the first 120 days. Israel fighter jets and U.S. cargo planes are up the top. Israeli tanks and vehicles. So it's not just a war on Hamas that Israel is fighting. It is, well, I can't really say this because every military does not report their environmental impact on the planet. They don't have to. COP20 or whatever, that doesn't have to have militaries that are saying or putting any kind of numbers behind it. Anything they release. So when we have numbers like this that are confirmed, it's quite shocking that you can see just the never-ending running of bombs to Gaza back to their airfield. We're not talking about the equivalent of energy released in all the bombs either, and the carbon footprint of those. And again, this is not a comparison of Hamas and Israel or comparison or analogy of anything else. We're just going by what this breaking article says. And to what end of the planet are they willing to go destroying Hamas? How many innocent people will be killed as a result of Israel's brutal war in Gaza? While the world's attention is rightly focused on the humanitarian catastrophe, the climate consequences of this conflict are also catastrophic, said Ben Nymark, a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London and co-author of the research. Yet our study is only a snapshot accounting for the major reported greenhouse gas emissions from the war machine in the first 120 days. One of the serious consequences of the war in Gaza has been the massive violation of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which represents a serious risk to life and the enjoyment of all of the rights. The region is already experiencing serious climate impacts that could get worse. The 120-day analysis, which builds on earlier research reported by The Guardian in January, includes direct CO2 emissions from bombing and reconnaissance flights, tanks, and fuel from other vehicles, as well as emissions generated by manufacturing and exploding hundreds of thousands of bombs, artillery, and rockets. We kind of touched on this before, talking about how Russia's war on Ukraine is a war on their environment, a war on the planet. Russia destroying the Kakhovka dam and hydroelectric power plant put 150 tons of engine oil in the river, surrounding river systems. Does that get put into any kind of chart or graph? It is horrific. And countries like Ukraine and Gaza just have to press forward and hope for the best and pray for a swift cleanup. For the first time, researchers also calculated emissions from trucks making the 370-mile or 595.5-kilometer round trip from Egypt to Gaza to deliver humanitarian aid to 2.3 million starving Palestinians trapped under bombardment. The 1,400 or so trucks Israel allowed to enter Gaza between early October and February generated almost 9,000 tons of CO2. I'll just say CO2e from now on instead of equivalent. Hope you don't mind. An additional 58,000 CO2e emissions came from diesel power generators now relied upon to generate electricity in Gaza after Israel damaged or destroyed the enclave's solar facilities and single power plant. Before the conflict, about 25% of Gaza's electricity came from solar panels, one of the world's highest shares. Quite apart from the unspeakable destruction in Gaza and across Palestine, this report lays bare the hypocrisy of Western nations who moralize about the perils of climate breakdown and the responsibility of every nation to protect the planet, all the while funding, aiding, and enabling the Israeli regime's catastrophic war and its implications for those affected by ongoing and future climate change. Zena Aga, policy analyst of El Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, who writes about the climate crisis in Israel of occupation. I'll pull that article up for later for me. It's going to take a lot of heavy machinery, a lot of hard work, and a lot of people to clean up this mess. And that's if Israel stops bombing soon. Not today, because there's no chance of that. Ceasefire is probably not going to ever be probable for Israel to ever accept. Because what is total victory? They can just keep changing the goalpost. I continue. Emissions generated by flights bringing aid to neighboring countries for onward deliveries to Gaza, methane emissions, conflict-related fires, and the forced displacement of millions of Palestinians are among other carbon CO2e sources emitted from the study due to missing data. and CO2e is carbon dioxide equivalent. The Israeli government did not respond to requests for comment on the research. Israel's assaults on Gaza after Hamas killed more than 1,100 people and took hundreds hostage has caused unprecedented death and destruction. Between 54% and 66% of all buildings in the Gaza Strip had been destroyed or damaged by February 14th. That number's a lot higher now. The economic cost of damage to critical infrastructure from the first 4 months is estimated at $18.5 billion, according to the World Bank and UN research. International legal experts have said Israel is committing domicide, the mass destruction of homes and living conditions to make a territory uninhabitable, and ecocide. Satellite imagery provided to The Guardian in March show that almost half of the Gaza Strip's tree cover and farmland has also been destroyed, while hazardous material left behind by the Israeli munitions pose a long-term threat to the entire ecosystem. In January, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, found plausible evidence that Israel's acts amount to genocide. The ICJ last month ordered Israel to halt its assault on the southern city of Rafah, which Israel has ignored, forcing more than 1 million Palestinian refugees to flee again, enduring dangerously high temperatures without adequate shelter, water, or food. As long as this war continues, the implications will be exacerbated with horrific consequences on emissions, climate change, and hindering climate action in Gaza. Yet despite mounting concern about the long-term environmental and climate consequence of this in every war and occupation, military emissions remain opaque and are rarely accounted for. Thanks in part to the pressure from the U.S., reporting military emissions to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, remains voluntary. Only 4 countries submit some incomplete data. Despite the lack of reporting, one recent study found that militaries account for almost 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually, more than the aviation and shipping industry combined, and higher than every single country except the US, China, and India. Neither the State of Israel nor Palestinian authorities appear to have reported military emissions. The new study estimates that Israel's baseline 2023 military carbon footprint without accounting for warfare was 3.5 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This amounts to about 5% of Israel's annual emissions. See here, Belize. This war is already surpassing Greenland, Bermuda, right behind Belize in terms of CO2 equivalent release. But life in Palestine and the border with Israel was militarized long before 7th October. In occupied Gaza, most Palestinians had long faced significant food, water, and energy infrastructure insecurity due to the Israeli occupation and blockade, population density, and the worsening climate crisis. Israelis, meanwhile, lived under the threat of rocket fire. To capture some of the climate consequences of the military setting, researchers calculated the carbon footprint of the conflict-related concrete infrastructure, walls, and tunnels in Gaza and Israel. We also cannot forget that Israel is literally pumping seawater into every crevice they can find in Gaza. So this is also going to have a horrible impact on the water tables of Gaza. And that it doesn't matter what happens now. The seawater has been pumped. There's no fix for this. They are poisoning, destroying, and killing the land. They are making it completely uninhabitable. They're turning Gaza into a complete wasteland. Capture some of the climate consequences of the militarized setting. According to the analysis constructing the Gaza Metro, the 500-kilometer long underground network of tunnels used to move and hide everything from basic supplies to weapons, Hamas fighters, and hostages, generated an estimated 478,800,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, more than the total 2022 emissions of St. Lucia, a climate-vulnerable Caribbean island. Building Israel's iron wall, which runs 65 kilometers along most of its border with Gaza, and features surveillance cameras, underground sensors, razor wire, a 20-foot-high metal fence, and large concrete barriers, contributed almost 312,387 TCO2e. This is more than Tonga, the South Pacific archipelago, facing an existential threat from sea level rise. The analysis does not account for pre-7th October emissions generated by the Israeli tanks, military vehicles, and soldiers who were constantly on the move in historic Palestine before this conflict, nor the full extent of the energy expended importing billions of dollars in weapons, fuel, and other military equipment each year. The carbon snapshot comes amid mounting calls for greater accountability of military emissions, which they don't have to. The figures show how significant the emissions from conflicts can be, yet there is no agreed international methodology on how to estimate these emissions, and as a result they are being overlooked, said Lindsay Cottrell, environmental policy officer at the Conflict and Environmental Observatory and co-author of the new study. It's vital that the carbon cost of war are counted alongside their wider humanitarian and environmental consequence. I could not agree more. Great article. Very eye-opening in the conflict. And the amount of carbon footprint that the countries are leaving. Ethiopia would be another military to look at regarding their carbon footprint when it comes to unreporting. That would be interesting. That was carbon reporting of repairing Gaza. Next. This is a much heavier article, a much longer article. It goes into far more detail than I could read on a stream. Yeah, this thing's like 20 pages long, but it is a great article, especially here where climate change, water availability, and quality. Next up, how do I write this? Nope. Women and climate disasters. Oh. Well, climate disasters and women. Yes, that will be the subtitle. Headline, yes. Women, this in theconversation.com, women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster than men. It's just one way climate change is gendered. When we think of climate and environmental issues such as climate-linked disasters or biodiversity loss, we don't think about gender. At first glance, it might seem irrelevant, but a growing increase this a little bit. Yeah, there we go. But a growing body of evidence demonstrates women and gender-diverse people are disproportionately vulnerable to the changing climate and consequences it brings. Women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate change-related disaster than men. Women represent 80% of people displaced by extreme weather. Although extreme weather events such as fires and floods might appear to affect everyone equally, the evidence shows crises exploit existing social fault lines. This means people who are already socially marginalized suffer exacerbated impacts. What does this look like? Women are acutely impacted by environmental crises because they experience pre-existing social and economic disadvantage. Another reason is they tend to take responsibility for caring for other vulnerable groups, such as children or other people. In a meta-analysis of 130 studies, 68% found women were more impacted by climate-linked health issues than men. Maternal and perinatal health is particularly affected by climate change hazards such as extreme heat. So too is the health of older women. Most disturbingly, studies across Australia and around the world have revealed gender-based violence consistency increases during and after disasters. Both the most recent National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children and the associated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan briefly recognize this. Even still, policymakers and service providers are yet to comprehensively grapple with what it means for women in an era of multiple and compounding disasters. Excuse me. The impact of climate change on housing and living is also experienced in gendered ways. The Climate Council estimates that by 2030, 524,940 Australian properties, or 1 in every 25, will be high risk and uninsurable. Rising cost of living, homelessness, and uninsured housing are all affecting Australian women, who are particularly vulnerable to losing food security and shelter. Over 2016-2021, men's homelessness increased by 1.6%, while women's increased by just over 10%. The Australian housing crisis is being exacerbated by the climate crisis, and these impacts are distinctly gendered. Leadership drives results. Research demonstrates women and gender-diverse people being crucial perspectives and leaderships to tackling these problems. They're not just helpless victims. Evidence from a range of sectors demonstrates gender-diverse leadership results in more effective and equitable approaches. Larger numbers of women in politics and policymaking results in stronger climate action policies. Despite this, at the COP28 climate talks in 2023, only 15 out of the 140 speakers were women. Only 38% of party delegation members were women. Gender diversity in industry leadership also yields environmental benefits. Research by the World Economic Forum shows that a 1% increase in women managers in a company results in a 0.5% decrease in carbon emissions. Boards with high gender diversity receive higher scores in environmental, social, and governance performance measures and have fewer environmental lawsuits. Interesting. Companies with more than 30% women on their boards display better climate governance, climate innovation, and sustainability performance. Yet, as of 2022, women hold just 1 in 4 executive leadership positions in ASX 300 companies. What is ASX 300 companies? It is a market. S&P, okay. At the current rate of progress, it will take a century for women to constitute 40% of chief executives among ASX 200 companies. Women and gender diverse people are also in the minority in renewable energy industries. Only around 30% of clean energy workforce is female. These women are predominantly in jobs such as office administration, accounting, and cleaning rather than trade qualified or engineering roles. In the recent federal budget, the government announced $55.6 million for a Building Women's Career Program. It also pledged $38.2 million to increase diversity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education and industries. These are welcome developments. But gender inclusion and equity need to be centered in major initiatives like the Future Made in Australia plan and the Net Zero plan. This would help achieve climate change mitigation targets and to ensure the associated economic benefits are genuinely inclusive. Deep social change will be required to adequately address these issues. This is not just a matter of making space for more women to take up leadership positions, but requires grappling with the fact gendered social and economic inequality is caused by discriminatory gender attitudes, leaving women and gender diverse people vulnerable to environmental impacts. Moreover, the kind of unpaid care work so often performed by women has been undervalued, but is foundationally to our economy, society, and environment. Fueling disaster recovery. Women also have a key role to play in preparing for and recovering from climate-fueled disasters. Research shows women tend to take on emotional and relational roles within communities, sustaining networks of care at the local level. Community-level care is crucial to helping local communities stay strong in the face of increasing disasters, the impact of which would often exceed the capacity of emergency responders. Our disaster response policies and agencies need to recognize the often gendered nature of community resilience work and deliberately support this kind of soft insurance. Climate and environmental issues do not affect us all equally. Women and gender diverse people are acutely affected. We need targeted policy responses that recognize this vulnerability. In addition, women and gender diverse people offer distinctive and much needed leadership styles. These approaches are urgently required if we are to rapidly transition to a renewable economy. The gendered impact of climate change is well recognized at the international level, including by the United Nations. Australia has ambitions to hold the COP31 Global Climate Change Conference with our Pacific neighbors in 2026. To be in the running, Australia needs to demonstrate it recognizes and takes seriously the gendered nature of climate and environmental issues. Fantastic article. Author Carla Pascoe Leahy, Adjunct Research, University of Tasmania. The author. And just very eye-opening. And women represent 80% of people displaced by extreme weather, while men make up a very small percentage of that, meaning children are the other big bulk of that number. Very interesting. Something to think deeply about. It's something to rethink about homelessness as climate disasters, flooding, tornadoes, damage to homes can cause a family to lose their home. Our next. Carbon dioxide levels surge. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are surging faster than ever to beyond anything humans have ever experienced, officials say. This is from CBSNews.com. One of the major drivers is the exceptional heat building within Earth's atmosphere has reached levels beyond anything humans have ever experienced, officials announced on Thursday. Carbon dioxide, the gas that accounts for the majority of global warming caused by human activities, is accumulating faster than ever, scientists from NOAA, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and the University of California, San Diego found. Over the past year, we've experienced the hottest year on record, the hottest ocean temperatures on record, and a seemingly endless string of heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and storms. NOAA Administrator Rick Spinyard said in a press release, "Now we are finding that atmospheric CO2 levels are increasing faster than ever." The researchers measured carbon dioxide, or CO2, levels at the Mauna Loa Atmospheric Baseline Observatory. They found that atmospheric levels of gas hit a seasonal peak of just under 427 parts per million in May, an increase in 2.9 parts per million since May 2023, and the fifth largest annual growth in 50 years of data recording. It also made official the last 2 years saw the largest jump in the May peak, when CO2 levels are at their highest in the northern hemisphere. John Miller, a NOAA carbon cycle scientist, said that the jump likely stems from the continuous rampant burning of fossil fuels as well as El Nino conditions making the planet's ability to absorb CO2 more difficult. This is a graph here going up higher and higher. The surge of carbon dioxide levels at the mounting station surpassed even the global average set last year, which was a record high of 419.3 parts per million, 50% higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. However, NOAA noted that their observations were taken at the observatory specifically and do not capture the changes of CO2 across the globe, although global measurements have proven consistent without those at Mauna Loa. CO2 measurements sending ominous signs. In a news release, NOAA said the measurements are sending ominous signs. Not only is CO2 now at the highest level in millions of years, it is also rising faster than ever. Ralph Keeling, director of Scripps CO2 program, said in a release, "Each year achieves a higher maximum due to fossil fuel burning, which releases pollution in the form of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Fossil fuel pollution just keeps building up, much like trash in a landfill. Carbon dioxide acts like a blanket in the atmosphere," NOAA explained. "Much like other greenhouse gases that amplify the sun's heat towards Earth's surface, and while carbon dioxide is essentially in keeping global temperatures above freezing, having such high concentration shoots temperatures beyond levels of comfort or safety. That warming is fueling extreme weather events, and the consequences are already being felt, with deadly floods, heat waves, and droughts devastating communities worldwide and agricultural seeing difficult shifts." The news from NOAA comes a day after the European Union's Climate Change Service, Copernicus, announced that Earth has now hit 12 straight months of record high temperatures, a trend with no sign in sight of a change. "We are living in unprecedented times. This string of hottest months will be remembered as comparatively cold." Very haunting words. thank you for joining me. Please, if you haven't already, like the stream, subscribe to the channel. Helps me out immensely and keeps me motivated in putting out more content similar to this. I have a bonus article. Metals from spacecraft, re-entry, and stratospheric aerosol particles. Significance. Measurements show that about 10% of the aerosol particles in the stratosphere contain aluminum and other metals that originated from the burnup of satellites and rocket stages during re-entry. Although direct health or environmental impacts at ground level are unlikely, these measurements have broad implications for the stratosphere in higher altitudes. With many more launches planned in the coming decades, metals from spacecraft re-entry could induce changes in the stratospheric aerosol layer. Very interesting. Okay, I'll save that article for later about giant viruses eating algae snow. Again, I thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me. I will reflect on a lot of what I've read. Goes in the same theme in climate change, just being exacerbated and everybody just shrugging it off that it's going to get better. It is only going to get worse unless we make it better, unless we give up certain luxuries. The 1% pollute as much as the 1/3 of the population. This is insane. This can't continue. And with just such a small number of people holding such a great number of pollution, keys to pollution, you would think that saving humanity would be a little more of an important direction to take. Please take care.